Hey all, welcome to Parker's Reef Product Spotlights. On today's episode, we're going to go into what the heck is an ATO? All right, thank you for joining me on another episode of Parker's Reef Product Spotlights, brought to you by Aquaristic Online. Now, in this video, we're going to go back a step and go over some of the things for our beginners into the hobby that a lot of the advanced reefers take for granted. And I figured in this video, we could start off with explaining just what the heck an ATO is, because it's a terminology or a acronym that gets thrown around a lot in this hobby. And we do quickly forget that sometimes beginners may not know what an ATO is, what it does, and some things to consider when looking for an ATO for their own aquarium. So let's jump into it and cover all of those points. All right, so starting off with the most obvious question, what exactly is an ATO? Now, an ATO, or automatic top-off unit, for its full definition, is something that replaces evaporated water in your aquarium. Now, you may all be familiar that water in a glass box will evaporate out through the air into your house. However, what you may not know is that the salt actually stays in the aquarium when the water leaves. So not only does your water level drop in your aquarium or sump, but the water actually gets saltier and saltier. Now, for those of you who don't know, salinity is one of, if not the most important parameters in our reef tank, and keeping it consistent as well as the level in our sump or tank consistent makes it much easier for our equipment to do its job and for our fish and coral to thrive. Now, of course, you can top off your water yourself with filtered fresh water known as RODI, reverse osmosis deionized water, or even just reverse osmosis depending on the area you're from. You can do that manually yourself at least once a day or a few times a day. But of course, in this hobby, there are no shortage of gadgets to do that for you, and that's where the ATO comes into play. Now, there are a number of different styles or approaches to implementing an ATO in your reef tank, from the most humble of beginnings with a gravity-fed float switch here. This one has a water source above, which connects via plumbing into this device here. When the float switch is down, or the water level is down, it allows fresh water to pass through into the sump, and then when that water level comes up, it closes this here. When that switch is down, or that float is down, it lets water pass through, and when it's up, it stops the water going through. It requires no electricity, is a super simple device. However, some considerations are that you need to have your freshwater source above the tank itself, or at least above this float, and of course you need a way to mount this securely in your sump. Now, the next most conventional style of top-off is your basic electronic device like this one from Auto Aqua here. It involves a power supply, a little sensor here, electronic sensor, and a pump which will then pump water from your RODI storage up into your tank or sump. Now, these work quite simply. The little sensor just basically sits at your water level. When the water drops below that sensor, it turns power onto the pump, which fills up your sump or tank. When the water level gets up to that sensor, it then stops, turning off the pump and keeping your tank perfectly level. Of course, there are some alternatives depending on your installation, and things like the Reef factory unit here works on a very similar process to the Auto Aqua. However, it does use a mechanical float switch rather than an optical sensor. But where this unit differs a little bit is the fact that it does not actually come with a pump. What it does is it switches an outlet on or off, allowing you to plug any pump you want into that device at all, which can be important if you have unusual circumstances where you need to pump that fresh water from a much further distance or from much lower below the tank. That's where the Reef factory really comes into play, by allowing you to plug any pump at all into this controller. And then last but not least is this unit here from Kamoa. This one actually comes with a solenoid which connects directly to your RODI filter, eliminating the need for a water storage reservoir at all. This will actually open up the solenoid, allowing your RODI unit to push that fresh water straight into your sump, and then turning off again when your level is correct. Now, that sounds like a fantastic idea, and in some circumstances it absolutely is, but the considerations you need to take are that you don't necessarily want to be switching your RODI filter on, off multiple times a day, because it will burn through their membranes quickly. Plus, usually the first few seconds of water passing through an RODI filter are actually quite high in TDS. So unless you have a very large system, or a situation where you're going to be having your top-off run for considerably long periods of time, this unit's probably not the one for you. All right, now there are 5 considerations I think you should consider when picking out the perfect ATO for your reef tank. Let's go over those now. All right, point number 1, and probably the most important point to consider, is the sensor location. Now, most reef tanks out there, whether they have a sump or a back changer, are designed to show the evaporation most in the return pump chamber. That will be the one where the water level will actually drop. Your display and all other chambers in your sump, unless they're getting very low on water, should remain at the same consistent level. So we're going to see that evaporation in the return pump chamber. That is where our sensor needs to go. Now, depending on which style of ATO you pick up, you're going to need to factor in how you're going to mount that sensor in there. From the magnetic sensors in the Auto Aqua to the mechanical float switches in the Reef factory, or to a bit of a hybrid in the Kamoa situation here, you need to make sure that your sensor is going to mount and be consistent there. You don't want that sensor to fall off, causing potentially a flood or a dry out of your tank. Now, the second thing to consider when picking the perfect ATO for you is the reservoir distance from your tank. Now, it may not be immediately obvious, but the small pumps such as the one in the Auto Aqua aren't massively capable of moving water huge distances. They deliberately include very small little pumps so that they can fit into very small reservoirs, but it does mean that they can only move water a couple of meters. So if you're going to pump water much further than that, I would consider something like the Reef factory level keeper here, and then plugging a peristaltic pump into it. If you are going to have the water reservoir near your tank, it's not going to need to be considered, and you can go for your standard style impeller pump. If you're not moving water a long distance, you can forget about that consideration and use pretty much any pump, but it's going to be cheaper and easier to use the small little impeller style pump that come in most ATO kits. All right, the third thing to consider when picking the perfect ATO for you, and it does relate to pump size again, is the reservoir you're going to use. You need to ensure that whichever ATO you pick, that pump is going to fit inside your reservoir if indeed it does run submersibly, which most pumps do. There's no use having the most beautiful reservoir out there if the ATO you buy, the pump cannot fit into it. All right, onto the fourth one, and one that a lot of people overlook, is some of the features or safety features included with those ATOs. Whenever you automate any task in your aquarium, you want to make sure that there are multiple redundancies in place. I'm sure you can all imagine how big of a disaster it would be if your ATO went rogue and just continued pumping RO into your tank. Not only would you have a flood, but you would also lose a lot of salinity out of your aquarium, which could be very harmful for both your fish and corals. We like to go for an ATO that has multiple safety functions built in, including some things like siphon breaks, overrun alarms, audible alarms, and of course some anti-dry running features. All right, the fifth and final thing to consider when picking the perfect ATO for your aquarium is of course the price. These devices do vary fairly drastically in price, so do go through those other features and considerations and look at which one is going to meet your needs, and probably not too much more. It's one of those things where you want to buy the perfect device, but you don't necessarily need to buy the best device out there because it can end up costing quite a lot of money. I would highly recommend jumping on the Aquaristic Online website, having a look through their full range of ATOs, because they've got a huge amount there to pick from, and you're guaranteed to find the one that's going to meet your budget and also your requirements for your reef tank. All right, guys, I will wrap the video up there. I hope you enjoyed it. It was my attempt at taking some of these things that experienced reefers take for granted and making them a little bit more accessible and easy to understand for the newcomers to the hobby. And an ATO is the perfect place to start, in my opinion, because the last thing you want to be doing is manually topping off your tank every day when there is no shortage of devices out there that can automate that task quite affordably and very easily for you. I do recommend jumping on the Aquaristic Online website. Those guys sponsored this video, so by all means support those who are supporting you. Get on their website, have a look through the range out there, and of course if you have any questions, comments or feedback, pop them in the comment section down below. I do personally reply to each and every comment there, so it is the best way to get hold of me. Other than that, guys, till next time, stay safe, keep reefing. Cheers, bye.